couldn't live without you when I tried to roam. Put me by the windows, let me see outside. Look at all the places where all my family died.
So Mark's come up from Lancaster. He's from Animal Think Tank and has been working with XR and Animal Rebellion, and maybe he'll be the best person to tell you about himself and what he's doing. So I'd like to hand it over to Mark, and please give him a big round of applause.
Right, cheers everyone. Yes, I just want to explore this idea of urgency with regards to climate emergency and what we're prepared to do about it as a society and as individuals. But before I start, I am from Animal Think Tank. It's an animal rights organisation or animal justice organisation. I just want to remind us that there is an urgency every day for billions of animals. So I'd just like us to take a minute's silence in memory of those billions of animals. Just to remember all those animals who are born into captivity, where they suffer and are killed. To remember how they love and how their families are torn apart. To remember how they resist every day and fight back every day. To remember those who free themselves and those who are freed by others. To remember all those, whether big or small, on the land or in the sea, as well as all those that are invisible to us in our everyday, in our homes and in our soils. And to remember all those whose homes and habitats are invaded and destroyed. But also to remember those who live free from human oppression and the possibility that this offers to all others. So I'll just take a minute's silence. So just for me to get a bit of understanding of who's in the audience, I'd just be interested to know who's been involved in Extinction Rebellion in the last year. Okay, a few people. And who sort of associates mostly with the climate change movement? Or is it, sees themselves fairly active in climate change? Okay, a few. And who see themselves more active, sort of in vegan or animal rights? And then I guess those who identify as both climate change activists and maybe vegan animal rights activists, sort of at a similar level. Okay, cheer. That just helps me understand who I'm talking to and what to emphasise and what not to emphasise so much. So I'm going to look at a new partnership. I'm going to explain a new partnership between Extinction Rebellion and what was initially Animal Think Tank and has now become Animal Rebellion. Something Roger Hallam said, you can spend years agreeing to work together, or you can work together to come to an agreement. And I guess we've taken the second approach, that we've dived in, formed a partnership, and we're going to trust that it's going to be of mutual benefit. I think what we'll bring to Extinction Rebellion and sort of the climate change movement is essentially an increase in numbers. The animal rights movement, the vegan movement, is one of the most organised and most large in numbers of street activists in the UK. So the potential to mobilise that community for climate change is very significant, I think. And I guess what we hope to do as Animal Think Tank, was Animal Rebellion, is to bring a plant-based message to climate change, particularly the end of factory farming and the end of commercial fishing. So essentially what we've got, what we're moving towards is a movement of movements. So this is Extinction Rebellion's aim, and I guess Animal Rebellion is the first partnership of a series of partnerships. So Extinction Rebellion are exploring working trade unions, the youth movement, communities in London, global justice, food scarcity movements. And essentially just came about early May. An activist within Extinction Rebellion who was vegan wanted to understand how she could promote veganism and animal rights more within Extinction Rebellion. She talked to Roger Hallam, who's a member of, or co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. He put her in touch with us, Animal Think Tank, and what was initially supposed to be a phone call between three of us and them, suddenly had 8 or 9 NGOs on the phone as well in a telephone conference. I think it was the 11th of May. 2 weeks later, we had a meeting in London with about 11 NGOs, and then that led to some meetings at the end of June, and that's essentially when we've kind of formalised and got this arrangement going. And we now have a team of 10 full-time people on Animal Rebellion. That's a tiny bit of the history. I mean, it's really been 7 weeks or something from the very first concept. I don't think, well, I'm not going to have the opportunity to tell you. Basically, we are in a climate emergency. I think any of the talks about Extinction Rebellion kind of go into the science of this, basically tell us that the science has kind of essentially been hidden from us, or we've deluded ourselves and not engaged with it. And time is really running out, and we need to be making really massive, significant shifts now, and not in the future. And that's kind of whatever way you look at the science. I mean, there's sort of reports looking at different levels and exactly when, and how you have to engage. But like basically, all the science is saying it has to happen now and urgently. So Extinction Rebellion has been engaging with this. This is essentially what they're demanding. They've got 3 demands. They're asking government to tell the truth about the climate emergency. And to a large extent, they've achieved this. That many councils around the UK in the last year have declared a climate emergency, and the government, I think, was it beginning of May, declared a climate emergency. And of course, that's only the beginning to telling the truth. But it is a symbolic victory. The debate was had in Parliament, and that sort of policy passed. The second demand is that government acts now and transitions to a net zero carbon society by 2025, which is only 6 years away, and that has massive implications for our society. And the third demand is that a citizens' assembly is introduced to deliberate on how we transition to a carbon neutral society. So I should say, there are some misunderstandings, I think, about Extinction Rebellion. So a lot of people complain, like, why does Extinction Rebellion not talk about veganism or demand that everybody goes vegan, or various other things? Essentially, Extinction Rebellion is not chasing individual change. I mean, what Extinction Rebellion is doing is asking the government to legislate for change, and then that will bring about change at an individual level. So Extinction Rebellion it has a no blame, no shame culture. So it's not asking people to stop flying, it's not asking people to stop driving, it's not asking people to turn the heating down, to buy different things, to stop buying, or to go vegan. It's not making any demands on individuals. It's presenting the science, you make up your own mind, but what it's demanding is that government changes. Within the XR demand, that we transition to a zero carbon society by 2025, of course, is implicitly the demand that we go to a plant-based society. We cannot achieve that as a country unless essentially we go vegan. That's something that we'll be looking at, and that's essentially what Animal Rebellion is doing, is bringing that message to the forefront now with the climate change debate, and working in partnership with XR to deliver that. I mean, I was a bit surprised. Dan seems to know less about XR than I expected. Clearly doesn't read the newspapers, watch the news. I mean, you probably can judge, yourselves to what extent Extinction Rebellion has been successful in the last year since essentially launched. I mean, from my perspective, I think it's had massive impact in that it has changed how society, how the public, and how politicians are talking about climate catastrophe. A statistic that I really like, that in the Tory party sort of leadership contest, amongst Tory party members, which are almost exclusively sort of above 65, sort of section of society that's generally less engaged in climate change issues, 65% now believe that climate change is a priority and list it in their top 3 issues for the leadership debate. So yeah, I think it's changed how we're talking, and of course it's been going 10 months and there's a long way to go, and I think there's a lot more and a lot impact that I expect Extinction Rebellion to have. So what I'm going to do then is just explore what Animal Rebellion is about. So it's independent of XR, and it's a partnership essentially between some of us who've mobilised part of the animal rights vegan movement with XR. So it's the beginning of a new organisation. And fundamentally, we have only been kind of formally going for like 2 weeks, I think, or slightly less. So things are still in flux. But like I said, we have got a team now, I think, of either 9 or 10 full-time people who are in the process of leaving their jobs to work on the project for the next sort of 5 months. One Norwegian, somebody who's just moved from Slovenia, and somebody who's moving next week from Italy to join the team. And everybody's kind of converging on London and working from the XR office temporarily until we get our own offices, hopefully, next to theirs. So similar to XR, we've got 3 demands, and these are still in formation and in discussion with XR about how can we best formulate our demands to sort of maximise impact. And I think what we're doing is, as we're becoming conscious that this is likely now to grow beyond just XR and Animal Rebellion to a movement of movements with multiple sort of constituents, then we're going to probably just align with the XR demands and then just explain the implication of those demands, essentially that, to transition to net zero carbon, then we have to transition to a plant-based diet. But fundamentally, again, if this is our starting block, what we're interested in is the government tells the truth about animal agriculture's contribution to climate emergency, to biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. That the government similarly acts now and begins a transition to end animal farming and end commercial fishing, and transition to a national plant-based food system by 2025. And again, that a citizens' assembly is put in place to deliberate on what is needed to transition and on the sort of morals and ethics of animal justice. So the first is telling the truth. And sort of, again, the science behind animal agriculture's contribution to climate destruction is, can't be argued with, although it's sort of much less popular as a message and is much less heard about. But I mean, fundamentally, it's a major, if not one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases. And it's sort of different studies will say anything kind of from 15 to 50% of all greenhouse gases come from animal agriculture. It's a major impact or use of land use around the world. It has massive impact on ecosystems everywhere, on with the pollution, the runoff, sort of essentially manure and sewage from animal agricultural farming. Massive impact on sort of aquatic ecosystems, or essentially rivers and seas. It depletes water resource globally, causes soil erosion. I'm going to say that we've got sort of 30 years worth of growing left on the world. It's a massive contributor to deforestation. So a sort of estimate of 67% of deforestation is directly related to animal agriculture. It pollutes massively. It's a food security issue, and they require so much more land than a plant-based diet. That is sort of in the global south, where they're growing plants that are then shipped to the global north to be fed to animals, and it's a big contributor to global poverty as a result. There's a lot of kind of very well established science on animal agriculture's contribution to climate catastrophe. I've just got one reference here that was sort of published last year. So this was what's called a meta-study. I mean, it's a summary of 570 other pieces of academic research on the environment, animal agriculture, a plant-based food system. And I'm not expecting anybody to be able to read that. It's quite hard enough to read in the actual paper itself. But I'm just going to take a couple of summaries from this paper. So this is one of the best summaries, I think, that's available at the moment. I mean, loads of people have attempted this. I mean, the United Nations published, a big report, something like, I don't know, maybe it was 10 or 12 years ago, about animal agriculture and the need to transition to a plant-based diet. The World Health Organization has published reports and tried to encourage governments to transition to a plant-based diet. Even, I think it was 5 years ago, we had an all-parliamentary food security committee in the UK. It was led by the Tory party, and even they decided we had to, as a country, go to a vegan diet. Has anybody done anything? No. So I guess that's part of the demand, is tell the truth. Let's get this message, which is well understood by politicians, is well understood by global institutions, well understood by science, but it's just not reaching the public. But a summary, basically, of some of the science is the lowest, production of animal protein. So that's like the meat that has the least impact on the climate is worse than the worst plant kind of impact on the climate. I'm not sure if I explained that very well, but basically all plants are better than all meat. Yeah. And that's if you look at it from a perspective of protein. If you look at it from a perspective of calories, it is even far, far worse that meat, dairy, eggs, animal agriculture delivers massively more impact on climate catastrophe or destruction rather than a plant-based diet. I mean, reading this report in preparation for this kind of shocked me, because although I've been on the climate scene for 20 years and I've been a vegan for 16, I was totally unaware of some of the facts. So this one really shocked me. The emissions from slaughterhouse waste alone is greater than most contribution of vegetable products. So that's just the waste from the animal agriculture system, let alone the stuff that actually goes into the food system. And the emissions from livestock feed, so that's plants, maize, soya, that's fed to animals, exceeds vegetable production impact on climate change. And then you have to look at all the impact of sort of transporting grains across the world, from the global south to the global north to feed these animals. So it's kind of like there is no argument. Yeah, like I'm sure a lot of the vegans in the room have been in pubs in their families, and there's loads and loads of arguments. You always get cornered about some particular weird thing, and I mean I've been, as a layperson, reading this and agreeing with it. Of course, I've never had to think about it as a work or job or seriously. So I've never had the numbers to my hand. So I was like, oh, I read something a few years ago. Whereas now, I have read it, and it's just like, it is categorical. Like, take no prisoners anymore. It's it's basically denying, I think, animal agriculture's contribution to climate catastrophe is the same as denying climate catastrophe itself. What also I found new, kind of reading some of the science behind this, is how the transition out of animal agriculture to a plant-based society would impact the world. So a few months ago I read front page in the Financial Times saying that if the world adopted a vegan diet, then land the equivalent of the size of Africa would be released for reforestation. And that shocked me. And I thought they got it wrong, but actually reading now this report, they were clearly right here on the back of this report. So basically we'd have a 76% reduction in land use if we shifted from animal agriculture to plant-based. So apart from the massive reduction in the impact on carbon emissions, so 50%, if we move to a plant-based society, then we could have a 50% reduction globally in climate emissions. In the UK, Europe and the US, it looks more like 73% because we have a much higher proportion of dead animals and animal secretions in our diet. But it would fundamentally enable reforestation to take place. So, I mean, the biggest monocrop that we have is pasture, is green fields. I mean, it looks natural to us, and it happened a few hundred years ago, and in some cases, it happened a few thousand years ago, depending on where you are in the UK. But we worry about deforestation elsewhere in the world, and we try to stop, countries in the global south kind of, improving their economies by not cutting forests. But, fundamentally we did it ourselves, and we got all the benefits 100 years ago, and we still have those benefits, which puts us at a sort of economic advantage. But, we have to reforest, we have to play our part that we demand of other countries, and we do have the possibility to reforest. We would become self-sufficient in food. I mean, at the moment, I think it's 50% of UK food is imported. I mean, if you're looking at the problems we're going to have with climate catastrophe, becoming food sufficient is going to, make life much more bearable for us. We're going to suffer less. We're going to have less probability of famine in our own country. I would also massively reduce or take away all the sort of costs associated with transportation, or that, the carbon emission costs associated with transportation. The other thing is, which I hadn't appreciated the numbers on, but if you shift to some fields from animal agriculture to plant, I'm getting this wrong. If you shifted a country's demand from an animal agriculture system to a plant-based one, then you'd lose your 50% of emissions associated with animal agriculture, but also because you would be able to reforest, then actually the impact of the reforestation is larger than the reduction in not eating meat and dairy and eggs. So actually you'd more than double then the impact. So I don't quite understand, I'm trained as a statistician, but it suggests in the paper that would mean we'd have a 71% decrease in carbon emission, which to me doesn't quite stack up. It should be a lot higher than that, I think. But that might be because, there's some anomalies, I guess, in how things are distributed around the world. But fundamentally, for 100 years, as land transitioned from being sort of green pasture to reforesting, then that land would be sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So you get a double win by shifting from an animal agriculture system to a plant-based one. Other things, so this is essentially a graph over the next 200 years, and this is kind of the 100-year mark. So basically the carbon impact from land drops massively. That's being used for agriculture, so starting with a sort of 50-50 split, whereas roughly at the moment between animal and plant-based in calories that we consume. You'd have a reduction in the impact on acid in the water and in the soil. So, I mean, our water is particularly becoming much more acidic, and that's, disrupting ecosystems, destroying ecosystems. I mean, a lot of research is saying that the acidification of the oceans will destroy us before climate change does. Strangely, you need even less arable lands. You need to grow less crops because a large proportion of crops are grown to feed to animals. So not only are you removing the land to grow or to farm animals, you also remove 19% of arable land. So essentially 90% of arable land is feeding animals rather than feeding humans. So a big drop in greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know how you say this, eutrophication. I think this is essentially pollution. Yeah, sewage or animal sewage going into our water. That means then there's too much nitrogen, too many minerals, too much everything else. And you've got algae and growing, we're disrupting ecosystems. And then sort of scarcity of water reducing as well by 20%. So that's essentially drought around the world, or the probability of drought in the world. So loads of benefits from a transition to a plant-based society. I just got some of those numbers. There's a kind of a summary. So essentially 83% of the world's farmland is used for animal agriculture. It's 57% of greenhouse gases, but it only provides 37% of protein and only 18% of the calories we eat globally. Yeah, I think I've covered all of those bottom ones. So what are we trying to do as Animal Rebellion? So Animal Think Tank, which I'm a member of, sort of set up roughly or started formulating its ideas at a similar time to Extinction Rebellion. And we've been thinking along a very sort of similar lines of how to do strategy and how to do organising. Essentially what we want to do is influence the climate debate about animal agriculture. And I guess, Extinction Rebellion at the moment has got a lot of press coverage. It's become popular in the media. It's, caught the public imagination. It's starting to capture the imagination of some politicians. And essentially, we want to leverage that interest from the public and the media and the politicians in Extinction Rebellion, in climate emergency, and direct some of that attention to what is required for that, and so put some light on the animal agriculture system. We want to influence climate activists. I'm sure the vegans in the audience are kind of aware of how often that can be quite frustrating, being in a climate space and everything is kind of up for grabs. You can all get told not to fly, not to drive a car, not to have your heating on, not to have children, but dare tell anybody to go vegan and you're thrown out the group. I'm exaggerating. You leave of your own accord. Essentially what we want to do is just to begin the debate at a societal level about ending animal farming and ending animal or commercial fishing. And the final objective that we have is essentially to bring to the vegan and the animal rights, animal liberation, animal justice movement the organising ideas of XR, which essentially is called momentum organising. It's a sort of a theory of change sort of been developed by academics in the US, looking at how significant social change has occurred around the world. And what mostly they've looked at is that most changes has occurred in the global south, and how the global south goes about social change is very different to how we in the global north go about social change. So what seems to be quite novel to us and can be very controversial, some of XR strategies in the UK are kind of well-practiced, well-adopted techniques in the global south. So lots of revolutionary action, throwing out dictators, demanding change in economies in the global south to kind of use the same organising techniques as Extinction Rebellion, and that's come to be known as momentum organising or momentum-driven organising. So, for those who are coming from an animal liberation perspective, this is a project. It is capitalising on the interest in XR and climate emergency. And what we're doing is taking advantage of that to use a messaging of climate catastrophe and the need to transition to a plant-based society. So our long-term objective as Animal Think Tank, kind of one of the organisations now behind Animal Rebellion, is to legislate to end the trade in animals, dead animals, animal secretions. So that's not encapsulated in the Animal Rebellion mission currently as it stands. What we're doing is that, this is essentially a campaign or a project that's taking advantage of the current environment to get to drive a message in society of the need to go plant-based, to normalise that debate, and then in time campaign on a more anti-speciesist agenda. So we kind of feel at the moment that using the climate change discussion is one of the best ways to bring about the end to commercial farming and fishing. So it's a strategy, essentially. So, there are loads of what we call theories of change. It's like, how do you change the world, or how do you change your society? It's not a word that we use. A lot of people would use the word strategy for this, like, what's your group's strategy, or how do your group operate? So in the UK, within the animal justice movement, you've got a few theories of change in operation at the moment, and it's mostly implicit rather than explicit. So there's direct action. So these are groups like the Hunt Sabs, the ALF, sort of Stop the Badger Cull, or people engaged in open rescue, who essentially go out and protect animals directly. A second one is protest, which is kind of like anti-vivisection, demonstrations against live export, demonstrations against sort of fur. So those have kind of been traditionally, I guess, where a lot of the animal rights movement has been in the last sort of 25, 30 years in the UK, and been at times very, very successful. What's sort of grown a lot at the moment is outreach. So you have, groups going on the streets, educating the public, trying to change the world one by one by getting people to go vegan, essentially. So you've got groups like Anonymous for the Voiceless, kind of Manchester Animal Action. So there's lots of animal action groups around the country. Save, that's kind of do vigils. And a lot of the NGOs, like the Vegan Society, work in this way. So education, outreach, change people one by one, asking them to adopt a vegan diet. And then other NGOs kind of engaged in incremental legislative change. So these are groups who are trying to maybe change the sizes of, and again, this can be the Vegan Society, or Viva, change the size of a cage for battery hens, ban certain practices, get cameras in slaughterhouses. And the idea here is like it's incremental. You get a little bit of change in law, and then you can ask for a little bit more, and then you can ask for a little bit more, and eventually in a couple of thousand years, maybe we'll have got somewhere. So the theory of change that Animal Think Tank or Animal Rebellion is following is like go for the big ask at a societal level. So this is called like structural change, like change the structure of society. And the key components are mass civil disobedience through non-violent action. So if you think about how the world has changed, all the success stories of history, like what are they? They're the suffragettes, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, the civil rights movement in the US, the Indian independence movement, the Chartists, the colour revolutions in sort of Eastern Europe. So these are all the success stories that we all celebrate as politicians, as a public, in our education system, in our schools, in our stories about the world. But yet, in contemporary society, if you try to use mass civil disobedience, you're told you're just making people look bad. There are groups who do certain actions and they're disruptive, and what's the messaging on the internet? All the argument is you're making vegans look bad, and we're not going to bring about change because of you. But history tells us this is the only way that change happens. There's a massive field of social movement theory. Just hundreds and hundreds of books and academics and institutes, maybe not hundreds of institutes around the world, to engage in how the world changes. And all the literature says that social change happens through the masses getting on the streets, withdrawing cooperation from the system, and demanding change. The good news on that is you don't need the masses. So what you need is 3.4% of a nation's population to bring about change. And so there's a military strategist in the US, it might be like 10 years ago now, trained in combat, entered into strategy, worked essentially, from what I can understand, the CIA, I think, in how to bring about regime change in countries around the world where the US wanted to influence regime change. And of course, at the time, or maybe this is going a bit back more than 10 years ago, the way the CIA changed the world was they funded guerrilla warfare. So Erica Chenoweth was kind of involved with this strategically and got involved in a debate about non-violence, said non-violence was rubbish, didn't change anything, set out to prove that, worked for a few years in collaboration with a university, and churned the data on something like 350 changes around the world, and discovered, to her surprise, that it's non-violent action that changes the world. So you have almost exactly twice the likelihood of success if you try to change the world non-violently as if you try to change the world violently. So you bring down, essentially these are mostly bringing down dictators around the world. But more interestingly is you have 5 times more chance of that the success you bring about having sticking after 10 years than if you've done it violently. So if you do it violently, you bring down a dictator, you have government change. After a few years, you're likely to shift back to a dictatorship or shift back to a sort of military rule. If you do it non-violently, you're 5 times more likely not to have that. So essentially, you're 10 times more likely to change the world through non-violent action. And she was the one then who discovered that 100% of the occasions, if you could mobilize 3.4% of the population to act, then you had guaranteed success. And acting was only on 3 occasions, So individuals only had to do 3 things. And some of that was fairly passive. It wasn't like, everybody being on the streets. It might culminate with like a few million on the streets in London as the last action. And that seems to be, this is the theory of XR, is in the global south a lot of the time. If you can get hundreds of thousands on the streets for a sustained period of time, it seems to be 10 to 11 consecutive days, then that is what will influence government to either collapse or bring about policy change. But the other 2 actions can be as little as sort of clicking on a petition or writing a letter to an MP or something. So it's the population have done something actively. What's crucial is that you've got it looks like a strategy team of like 20 to 30 people working full time for a few years. And then you've got something like 5 to 30,000 people who are really dedicated to the cause and willing to get out regularly onto the streets and organise locally to do that. So it does seem like 30,000 people, and I think it's somewhere like 2.6 million people for the UK to just take 3 actions, and you've kind of got a guaranteed success of change. So that's a lot easier than what I thought. So 4 years ago, when I set out on this journey of like how are we going to bring about a plant-based society, there's still a lot of people to mobilise. But then sort of within the XR and now sort of the animal rebellion sort of theory of change, there's a whole pile of guidance on how do you go about making that happen. Essentially, there's this kind of a cycle. You do an action, you generate a bit of buzz, you put a lot of effort into then absorbing the people who've participated in that action passively or actively. Get people to join up to your newsletter, spend time doing that, then get all of those people into roles, whether just like half an hour a week or something, or 1 day a week, and then take another action. And you keep going around this cycle and you kind of grow your movement exponentially. And a lot of movements seem to have managed to get to the point of successful change within 1 to 2 years of starting action. What's crucial to this is you spend a lot of time planning. So Gandhi spent 10 years planning essentially his first action. Otpor, which is a revolutionary group in Yugoslavia, or then Serbia, they spent 10 years fighting a dictator. They gave up. I think they had sounds like a year off, and then they spent about 40 months, from what I can tell, getting their new plan together, and then about a year then implementing that. Again, the civil rights movement is hard to tell, but I was chatting recently to one of Martin Luther King's strategists, and it was very clear that they spent much more time planning than I'd appreciated, and they put all their organisers through a 6-month training course. So I was chatting to somebody who ran the Selma campaign, and he was only 22 when he ran one of the most well-known campaigns, I guess, for voting rights in the South. And I just asked him what gave him the authority to, I guess, have command over the black community in Selma, and he just said, my training. It was just like, I did 6 months training and nobody else had, and so they listened to me. So I think that's something where we can fail in the climate movement and in the animal justice movement, is to invest a lot of time in strategizing, organising, building structures, thinking through our story, what's our messaging to the public, and sort of generating a good internal culture, and then planning how to put that into operation. So that's something we've been doing at Animal Think Tank kind of quietly for the last year, and Animal Rebellion now is our first project to see how some of those ideas might work, and we're very much sort of treating it as a learning project that we're going to participate with XR in their next campaign for 2 weeks in October. We've committed to getting 10,000 animal justice people on the streets in London in October, and shutting down some sites associated with animal agriculture. So London's got some amazing, from a sort of campaigning perspective, sites. I mean, they've got the biggest meat or dead animal wholesale market in Europe, right in the centre, sort of between St Paul's and the Old Bailey. You've got a massive wholesaler of fish, large dairy. You've got the Old Bailey itself and St Paul's to demonstrate against, and DEFRA. And we're kind of very minded that if you can get 10,000 people to the Animal Rights March in London, then we should be able to get 10,000 people to a sort of sustained campaign. So that's kind of our plan. I'm trying to think if there's more to the plan. It's basically get 10,000 people to London to block a few sites associated with animal agriculture at the same time as Extinction Rebellion will be blocking sites, roads essentially, associated with fossil fuels. So doubling the numbers of Extinction Rebellion and holding those sites hopefully for 2 weeks. So that's what we're doing. This is what you could potentially do. So these are our 3 actions to match our 3 demands. You could help organise. So at the moment, so the working group is, I mean, they're just sort of leaving their jobs. They've been having a few one-day meetings. I was sort of involved in facilitating some of those last week. They're kind of coming together as a group over the next 2 weeks, and then, so probably in 2 or 3 weeks' time, we'll be looking for new recruits to be working either full-time, part-time, like ideally kind of 3 days a week, and then at a later stage sort of taking on people who've, maybe got 10 hours a week or something to lend a hand. We are trying to put together a hardship fund to enable people to leave their jobs and at least get sort of bare minimum living expenses paid. Second thing you might be interested in is coming to London for the Animal Rights March. So we're going to have a small practice at the Animal Rights March. It's still in planning. We're going to take an action for about an hour together with 10,000 people, and we're going to train. We're going to have a mass training of 10,000 people in how to do non-violent civil disobedience. So I think at the moment that's scheduled to start at 12 o'clock. And then there will be the Animal Rebellion itself in London. October the 7th is still provisional, but we've got 40 countries signed up, so I'm not sure how the team who's organising it in XR are actually going to go against this date. But it still hasn't been officially released. So we're asking people who are interested in participating to get trained. So that's essentially going to be similar to the XR style. If you're involved, you go to 2 meetings of 2 hours. I guess this might be the first one. You find out what we're doing. And the second one then is to undertake a 2-hour training in non-violent civil disobedience. So that's essentially ensuring people know what to do, what not to do, why to do things or why not to do other things. And acting non-violently can be a challenge, however philosophically committed you are to non-violent action. When you've got police, when you've got thousands of people around you, you've got maybe angry people around you, you've got people who've been drinking or smoking dope, and then the police, they've got their tactics to wind you up, and they might corral you or something. Your anxiety can go up, and it can be quite hard to maintain a calm. So it's kind of like going through some techniques about how to try and maintain non-violence. So this is it's kind of absolutely critical to changing society from the literature and from particularly Erica Chenoweth's study, is that even very, very small pockets of violent action within a non-violent movement can totally undermine the movement entirely. Essentially, yourselves, or you can have thousands of people on the streets, and you only had 3 people to do something, and that's what's in the Daily Mail, and that's what's on the BBC News. I read a stat something recently that of Palestinian action, something like 98% of all Palestinian action is non-violent. But I've never seen any of that reported in like my 20 years of an adult in the newspapers or on TV. I've only ever seen the violent action. There are some really, really horrific stories in the kind of old animal rights scene of people getting framed for violence, particularly people who are thinking strategically, leading groups non-violently, but then being sent to prison for 5 or 10 years because of violent action that took place by other individuals. So get trained, book time off work. Now we're going to try and hold these sites for 2 weeks, so we're going to need a few thousand people every day. So that is, holding Tuesday to Thursday, especially if it's cold and wet, might be quite hard. So we're going to need people to commit to, particularly Tuesdays to Thursdays, but Monday to Friday as well as the weekends, to be present in London. Get engaged in the action. Now, there are loads of ways you can get engaged. You don't have to be on the streets. There will be loads of backup work both in the office as well as catering, doing legal support, doing trainings for people who are joining, helping people join. So there'll be loads of, if you don't feel comfortable being on the streets, or you might be not have the capacity to do that, then there's loads of stuff that you can do to support people who are taking action. And the way that XR's organised essentially is sort of green, amber and red, and you can be very willing to be arrested, willing to be considered to be arrested, or definitely don't want to be arrested. So the agreement that was with the police for April's rebellion was that the police would warn any individual and give them 5 minutes to leave a site or risk being arrested. And one of my mates was arrested, and he said, a policewoman came up to her and said, do you mind stepping onto the pavement or I'm going to be forced to arrest you in 5 minutes' time. And then she came back and said, do you mind stepping onto the pavement or I'll be forced to arrest you in 3 minutes' time? And she came back at the 2 minutes and the 1 minute. She said, no, I'm going to arrest you. So I think, basically he had loads of opportunities not to get arrested. I'm just emphasising that because there's a lot of stuff in the social media about XR wanting everybody to get arrested. They don't. It requires some people to get arrested, and essentially what that is about it generates media, but it puts pressure on politicians. So basically the police are going to politicians and saying, we can't arrest this number of people. It's detracting us from our work. The Metropolitan Police can only arrest 400 people a day. So if you've got a pile of climate change activists, every person they arrest is risking not being able to charge somebody else committing more serious offence. So the police do not want to be arresting climate change activists. The judiciary then, the legal system, at the moment they've got, 1,100 and something people to charge. That clogs up the court systems. Again, judges are in short supply. They don't want to be processing climate change activists, so they start putting pressure on the politicians. So this is essentially one of the components of the theory of change. Is basically you clog up the police system and you clog up the court system, and potentially you clog up the military system as well. I don't think that we'll come to that in the UK, or not at least until we've got a new Prime Minister. And these are just, if you are interested in sort of getting involved and helping organise, these are currently some of the teams that we've got going. We've got going around doing talks, a bit similar to this, and then doing the trainings for 2 hours in non-violence. Just starting to promote the event in about 2 weeks' time and doing sort of media comms work, actually helping plan the action, toilets, tents, walkie-talkies, scouting the sites, understanding, which is the best position to block, how the police might operate, where, depending where we block. Legal work, so supporting people who get arrested, loads of project management work, tech, that's essentially email newsletters, but essentially anybody who is interested in getting involved, making sure that they have the opportunity to get involved, so building sort of IT systems to enable that. Loads of office stuff to do, culture stuff, which is just ensuring that the movement and the individuals involved are kind of sustained. Individuals don't burn out, and that the movement is sustainable as a whole. Doing research, improving kind of this talk with all the science, and providing that science then to the people who are doing the media work, and then fundraising. So XR's budget for April was, I think, £470,000 to mobilise 10,000 people. So we're going to have to get something of a similar nature together for October's Rebellion. So we have managed to hit £100,000 already. So we had a very generous one-off donation of 100 grand. So that's got us started. That's enabled us to say, okay, we can go with this, but we've got about another 370 grand to go. And then just loads of volunteer roles then in those 2 weeks from October the 7th. So we currently haven't got a common system in place that's particularly effective at getting people who want to volunteer to volunteer. But if you are interested, then we have got a Facebook group. It's called Animal Rebellion Working Group. And if you just message that group, or if you just post in that group, then Dora from our team, she is collecting that, getting you into a spreadsheet, and then in about 2 weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, you will get contacted when we know exactly what we're doing. So a fundamental that we've learnt about how to make change happen in the world is sacrifice. That individuals do need to sacrifice elements of their life, and whether that's time, money. I mean, I left my job a year ago. I used to be an academic. I had a cushy life. I downsized. So I've got a house that's worth less than half what it used to be. I now bin dive, so like almost all my food comes out of bin. I used to teach strategy at a top 10 university. I don't drink anymore because I can't afford it. I don't get coffees out because I can't afford it. I don't go on holiday. I have an amazingly creative life, and I engage with amazingly creative individuals, and my life is so much better for it. But it has taken a certain amount of shifting my mind, I guess, getting over things, getting over how we're, brainwashed and socialised into contemporary culture and consumerism. And it will require sacrifice to be on the streets. It will require sacrifice of some to go to jail, or at least be arrested. It's not going to jail, is it, generally? You normally let out in a few hours, maybe the next day. But it is likely, nearly all social change around the world has happened when certain individuals have gone to prison for extended periods of time. And there've been many in the animal rights movement who've gone to prison for 5, 7, even 10 or 11 years in the past, particularly associated with the Shack campaign. So I guess I'm asking all of you, kind of where's the urgency and where's the sacrifice? And I guess what sacrifices are you willing to make in bringing an end to animal agriculture and bring about a sort of government change to policy around climate catastrophe? And so what are you willing to do to help volunteer and organise? So that's the thought that I'm going to leave you with. And yeah, I am open to questions So, it's 10 to 9. So if anybody needs to go, then like do a quick run out of the room, and I won't mind at all. But yeah, anybody got any questions? Oh. So I'd just like us to take a minute's silence in memory of those billions of animals.
Put me on the train, send me back my home. Couldn't live without you when I tried to roam. Put me by the windows, let me see outside. Look at all the places where all my family died, where all my family died, where all my family died, where all my family died.